Imagine like a wood cricket. It's this insect that is just biologically hardwired to avoid water at all costs. It wants absolutely nothing to do with it.
Right, it stays as far away as possible.
Exactly. But when it gets infected by this specific neuroparasite called a hairworm, its brain is entirely hijacked. The cricket just joyfully, willingly jumps into a lake and drowns itself.
Which is just terrifying to picture.
It really is. And why does it do it? Because the water is literally the only environment where the parasite can complete its reproductive cycle. So the host happily destroys itself just so the parasite can thrive.
It is a horrifying visual, for sure, but it's actually the perfect mechanism for understanding what we're looking at today.
It is. So welcome to your custom deep dive. Today, we're taking the stack of sources you provided, specifically a recent transcript from Joe Rogan Experience number 2497, featuring evolutionary behavioral scientist Dr. Gad Saad.
Yeah, and we're asking a pretty terrifying question, actually.
We are. Can human empathy act like that neuroparasite? Like, can our desire to be kind become so overpowering that it literally erases our survival instinct?
Saad actually coined a really provocative term for this. He calls it suicidal empathy.
Suicidal empathy. Well,
Yeah, and to understand where this gets in, we kind of have to look at his previous work. Because for years, Saad has focused on how our cognitive systems get hijacked.
right, like how bad ideas destroy a person's ability to think rationally.
Exactly. But this new concept shifts the focus entirely. This is about our affective systems, our emotions. It's what happens when the moral impulse to show compassion completely overrides the basic biological instinct for self-preservation.
Basically, dying to be kind.
Yeah.
So our mission for you today is to pull this apart. We're going to map out how this suicidal empathy plays out in individual people, how it scales up into cultural dynamics, and how it violently collides on the stage of global geopolitics.
And we need to be crystal clear right up front about this.
Yes, absolutely. The source material gets into incredibly heavy, highly debated political and cultural realities. Our job here isn't to tell you who is right or wrong. We are maintaining a strictly neutral, analytical lens just to show you the underlying mechanics of these arguments. So let's unpack this.
To really grasp the mechanics of how an emotion becomes a parasite, we need to look at Aristotle's concept of the golden mean.
Oh, right.
Aristotle argued that virtue is never an absolute, right? It's always found on the middle ground between a deficiency and an excess.
Like the classic example is courage, I think.
Exactly. Too little courage makes you a coward. But an excess of courage, that makes you a reckless martyr who just throws their life away for absolutely no reason.
Which means empathy has to operate on that exact same sliding scale.
It does. I mean, if you lack empathy entirely, you're a psychopath. You literally cannot function in a cooperative human society because you just can't recognize the humanity in the person standing next to you.
Empathy is the foundational requirement for civilization.
Right. But if that empathy goes into overdrive, if it becomes hyperactive and misdirected, you cross that golden mean. You end up sacrificing your own survival or the survival of your community just to appease an ideology.
I think the best way to visualize what Saad is talking about here is to think about your own immune system. Like, a healthy immune system is brilliant. It's your absolute best defense against external threats.
Right. It keeps you alive.
But sometimes that system becomes overactive. It loses the ability to distinguish between a dangerous foreign invader and its own healthy, vital tissue.
It starts attacking the host.
Exactly. It becomes an autoimmune disease, and the body literally begins to attack itself. What Saad is arguing is that suicidal empathy is essentially an autoimmune disease of the human moral compass.
That autoimmune analogy is exactly what we see playing out in the real-world examples from the source material. And honestly, some of these anecdotes are genuinely jarring to hear.
Jarring is an understatement. As you listen to these examples, keep that idea of the moral compass attacking itself in mind. The source brings up a judge who openly apologized to the would-be assassin of Donald Trump.
Wait, apologized?
Yes, because the conditions of the assassin's windowless cell were, quote, mean.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It also details the story of a Norwegian rape victim who literally cried in existential guilt when his Somali attacker was deported.
He was weeping for his attack.
He was weeping because he was terrified the attacker wouldn't have the opportunity to flourish back in his home country.
That is just, the list goes on too. There is a German rape victim who intentionally lied to the authorities. She claimed her attacker spoke German instead of Arabic or Farsi,
Just to protect them.
specifically to protect migrant communities from facing societal marginalization.
And there was a person in New York who refused to press charges against a violent felon,
Hmm.
a man who had just pushed a completely innocent commuter onto the subway tracks.
Why wouldn't they press charges?
Because the victim didn't want to be responsible for putting another black man into the penal system.
What's fascinating here is when you hear those stories, the immediate question is how? Like, how does a human brain bypass its own profound trauma to protect the person who inflicted it?
It doesn't seem to make any biological sense.
Right. Saad explains that this cognitive dissonance is resolved through a concept called the blank slate premise, or tabula rasa.
Okay, what is that exactly?
This is a major pillar of social constructivism. It's the belief that every single human being is born with a completely empty mind, totally equal in potential, and society is the sole architect of who we become.
Which, I mean, on the surface is a beautiful, deeply optimistic idea. As a parent, you want to believe that if you just curate the perfect, loving environment, your child has limitless potential.
It is optimistic. But when that premise is applied universally to violent criminal behavior, it becomes the engine for suicidal empathy.
Oh.
Think about the mechanics of it. If society is 100% responsible for shaping a person, then the blank slate premise dictates that a criminal can never truly possess personal agency.
Oh, I see. They're just a product of their environment.
Exactly.
Hmm.
They're merely a pure, helpless victim of a white supremacist society or systemic poverty or an abusive childhood.
So the brain of the victim does this incredible gymnastics routine. Punishing the attacker feels like doubly victimizing them.
Right.
The empathy for the attacker's theoretical past completely shuts down the victim's threat detection system in the present.
Exactly. Acknowledging the attacker's personal agency would shatter the victim's ideological worldview.
Right.
So the effective system just turns off the survival instinct to preserve the ideology.
But I have to push back on Saad's framing here, just, playing devil's advocate. Are these individuals actually hijacked in the way a wood cricket is, or are we just looking at an extreme, maybe incredibly naive form of radical compassion?
It's a fair question.
Because the line between being deeply forgiving and being suicidally empathetic feels a bit blurry to me. Although the source does bring up a test case that really pushes this to the limit, the Queers for Palestine movement.
Yeah, that is the ultimate stress test for this theory. The source material details a street interview with a protester who openly acknowledges they are queer,
Right.
and they also openly acknowledge that Hamas, the group they're protesting on behalf of, would canonically execute them for their sexual identity.
It's just absolutely wild.
Yet the protester insists that the very real, literal threat to their own life does not invalidate the group's need for their support.
Rogan actually points out during the interview that at this level, empathy stops functioning like an emotion and starts functioning like a religion.
That's a good way to put it.
It requires a complete abandonment of logical self-preservation in order to adhere to the dogma. Like, the desire to show ultimate compassion for a marginalized group completely erases the reality that the group would do you harm.
But this blank slate empathy doesn't just stop at the courtroom doors or at a street protest. When this localized mindset scales up and infects an entire society, it completely rewrites how that society interacts with the rest of the globe.
Oh, wow.
Saad calls this macro-level phenomenon cultural theory of mind.
Cultural theory of mind. Okay, if individual theory of mind is my ability to put myself in your shoes and understand your perspective, I'm guessing this is that exact same assumption mapped onto entire civilizations.
That's the exact mechanism, yeah. The argument is that the modern West operates with this massive, dangerous blind spot.
What's the blind spot?
The West assumes that its core values, things like magnanimity, extreme generosity, and radical empathy, are universally interpreted in the exact same way by every other culture on Earth. The West basically projects its own moral framework onto everyone else.
Which Saad argues is a fatal miscalculation, because in many other parts of the world, and specifically within fundamentalist ideologies, those traits are not viewed as virtues.
Not at all.
Offering unilateral forgiveness or radical empathy isn't seen as magnanimous. It is interpreted strictly as weakness. It's seen as a vulnerability begging to be exploited.
And to understand why Saad is so adamant about this cultural blind spot, you really have to look at his personal history, which heavily contextualizes his perspective.
Right, his background is intense. He was born a Lebanese Jew, and his family lived in Lebanon until the Civil War broke out in 1975.
Yeah.
Most of the Jewish community had already read the writing on the wall and fled the country, but his parents stayed behind because they had deep business ties. Eventually, the reality of the war caught up with them, and his parents were kidnapped by the Abu Nidal militant group.
The psychological warfare they endured during that captivity is harrowing.
Truly. I mean, the militants separated his parents to break them down. They tried to force them to sign false confessions claiming they were Israeli spies.
Which would have given the militants the legal cover they needed to just execute them.
Exactly. At one point, the captors were actively taunting Saad's mother, telling her they had already murdered her husband. But as she was sitting in her cell, terrified, she heard this distinct whooping asthma cough echoing from another part of the compound.
Oh my God.
And she recognized it instantly as her husband's cough. That was the only way she knew he was still alive.
When you hear a story like that, it really forces you to ask a critical question about the lens through which Saad views the world.
Like what?
Does surviving a high-stakes, hyper-violent environment give someone absolute clarity on the darker realities of human nature? Or does that level of trauma permanently color their worldview with an inescapable hypervigilance?
That tension right there is the beating heart of the source material. Like, is his warning about the West's suicidal empathy an objective truth, or is it the trauma talking?
It's hard to separate the two.
Because when these two wildly different interpretations of empathy collide, the Western blank slate versus historical realism, we arrive at the core of the geopolitical debate in the source, specifically the massive debate they have regarding U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East.
This segment of the source material is fascinating because you, as a listener, probably know the historical events they reference. But what Rogan and Saad are debating is how Westerners perceive these events through the lens of empathy versus accountability.
They present two totally conflicting perspectives on causality.
Right.
Rogan's perspective leans entirely on historical causality and the undeniable trail of Western meddling. He argues that you simply cannot look at the radicalization in the Middle East without acknowledging what the U.S. and its allies did to destabilize the region.
He brings up some specific examples.
Yeah. He points straight to the 1953 CIA-backed overthrow of the democratically elected Iranian government. The U.S. and Britain orchestrated a coup largely because British Petroleum wanted to stop Iran from nationalizing its own oil. Rogan argues that single event planted the seeds for the Islamic Revolution decades later.
And he applies that same logic to more recent conflicts, too.
Exactly. He points out that removing Gaddafi turned Libya into a failed, chaotic state, and the invasion of Iraq created the massive power vacuum that allowed ISIS to flourish.
So from his view, it's all connected.
From Rogan's viewpoint, the empathy that Westerners feel for the Middle East is rooted in acknowledging past sins. The West isn't a victim of sudden radicalization. The West is the primary catalyst for it.
Now, Saad pushes back on this narrative incredibly hard. He argues that this constant need to blame the U.S. relies on what he calls an amnesia of causality.
Amnesia of causality.
Yeah, it is that blank slate premise scaled up to geopolitics. By blaming the West for everything, you strip the actual immediate perpetrators of violence of their personal agency.
Okay, I see.
He poses this dark hypothetical. Imagine a 12-year-old Iraqi kid who steals a loaf of bread and has his hand chopped off by ISIS under fundamentalist law. It makes absolutely no sense for that child's parents to shake their fists at American foreign policy.
Because ISIS is the one swinging the blade.
Exactly. The immediate actor must be held responsible.
He actually uses this highly absurd, kind of hilarious analogy to drive that point home. He says that blaming historical U.S. foreign policy for the actions of a modern, brutal dictator is like blaming Barry White's romantic R&B music for the conception of that dictator.
Wait, Barry White?
Yeah.
The mechanics of that analogy are clever, actually. He's saying, yes, the romantic music was a catalyst. It set the mood. It created the specific environment for the parents to conceive a child.
Right.
But when that child grows up and becomes a dictator who slaughters millions of people, he still have total personal agency. You cannot put the dictator's crimes on Barry White's ledger.
I mean, I get the point he's making about agency, but I have to push back on that, and Rogan pushed back on it in the episode too. Actively overthrowing a government, funding armed rebel groups, and dropping literal bombs is a massively more direct cause of regional devastation than playing a record.
It's a very fair point.
There is a profound difference between setting a romantic mood and setting someone's house on fire.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it highlights the central friction we keep coming back to. Do we assign blame based on the historical root cause, the people who started the fire decades ago, Or do we assign blame to the immediate actor holding the weapon today?
It's a massive tug of war.
And that ideological tug of war reaches its absolute peak when the source dives into the ultimate flashpoint of this entire conversation, the Israel-Gaza conflict.
This is where we really have to rely on that impartial mapping we talked about, because the source material outlines the two deeply entrenched sides of this debate in America today.
Let's lay them out.
Rogan focuses on the empathetic response of the Western observer. He points out that the profound, sweeping anti-Israel sentiment we are seeing on college campuses and in the streets is not necessarily rooted in historical prejudice. Instead, it is a direct, visceral response to asymmetrical devastation.
It is an empathy triggered entirely by the visual reality of the present moment.
Exactly. People are looking at the U.S.-funded Israeli military, which is, one of the most technologically advanced on the planet, engaging in a campaign that has left an estimated 70,000 dead.
And entire cities reduced to gray rubble.
Right. The empathy is a completely human reaction to the sheer, overwhelming scale of the humanitarian disaster. The power dynamic is so lopsided that the Western effective system automatically empathizes with the population suffering the most visible destruction.
Saad, however, argues from the perspective of an existential threat. He points out that Israel, a nation with a 73% Jewish population, but crucially a nation where Muslim citizens have full voting and civil rights, faces an adversary whose canonical, openly stated goal is not a political negotiation.
What is their goal?
The stated goal is the complete eradication of Jews.
And to prove his underlying thesis, that ultimate empathy does not cure fundamentalist radicalization, Saad brings up the story of Yahya Sinwar, the architect of the October 7th attacks.
This anecdote really anchors Saad's entire argument about suicidal empathy.
It's a pretty crazy story.
Yeah. Years before the attacks, Sinwar was serving time in an Israeli prison. And while he was incarcerated, he developed a terminal brain tumor.
Right.
From a purely cynical self-preservation standpoint, the Israeli authorities could have just let nature take its course and eliminated a sworn enemy. Instead, an Israeli neurosurgeon operated on Sinwar and saved his life.
And then he was released, right?
And later released in a prisoner swap, yeah. Saad uses this to demonstrate that extending the ultimate act of medical empathy to an adversary did absolutely nothing to soften Sinwar's worldview.
It didn't buy a shred of goodwill.
None. It merely allowed him to live long enough to orchestrate a massacre.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The source material takes a fascinating turn here. It zooms out from the immediate violence in Gaza to ask a much older, broader sociological question. Why is there so much global, historical animus specifically directed towards Jewish people?
To explain the mechanics of that animus, Saad references a sociological concept coined by Yale law professor Amy Chua. It is called the theory of market-dominant minorities.
This concept blew my mind because it applies to so many different cultures. A market-dominant minority is a very small demographic group that overwhelmingly dominates the economic or professional landscape of the broader culture they live in.
And Chu's research shows that whenever this specific dynamic exists, it always generates intense, localized hatred.
Let's look at how it works.
Well, if you look at the Chinese minority in the Philippines, or the Indian minority in East Africa, or the Lebanese in West Africa, you have a tiny fraction of the population controlling a massive percentage of the wealth and commerce.
So how does the majority population react to that?
Resentment builds. The majority population looks at this minuscule group boxing wildly above its weight class, and they feel humiliated. But instead of internalizing their own economic failures, which is painful, the majority externalizes the blame.
Oh, I see.
The psychological defense mechanism is to turn that successful minority into a universal scapegoat.
Saad argues that Jewish people are the ultimate historical example of a market-dominant minority, but on a global scale. Because they are highly represented in fields like medicine, law, finance, and academia, they trigger that exact same psychological defense mechanism across multiple cultures simultaneously.
He actually quotes the economist Thomas Sowell to drive this point home.
What was the quote?
Sowell was once asked what it would take for people to stop hating Jews. And Sowell gave a one-word answer.
Fail.
Fail.
The argument being that if they simply stopped succeeding at such disproportionate rates, the envy-driven animus would evaporate.
It is a deeply cynical view of human nature. But it ties directly back to that autoimmune metaphor we started with. Whether we deal with the resentment of a market-dominant minority, the historical trauma of the Middle East, or the biological urge to protect a violent criminal on a subway platform, our emotional systems are constantly being manipulated.
Sometimes they are manipulated by bad actors, and sometimes they're manipulated by our own desperate need to be kind.
Exactly.
So, synthesizing all of this deep dive really highlights an incredibly complex tug of war between profound human compassion and harsh realism. We want to believe that everyone is a blank slate. We want to believe that love and understanding can cure any radical ideology.
But the reality is much more complicated.
It is. Whether we are looking at a judge in New York or the tragic geopolitical stage of the Middle East, the line between a noble, civilized empathy and absolute self-destruction is razor thin.
And the takeaway for you listening to this is about questioning your own default settings. It is about recognizing when your deeply held desire to be understanding and forgiving might actually be shutting down your ability to see the hard reality of a situation.
Yeah.
Empathy is the greatest tool humanity has. But like any tool, if it is applied blindly, it can dismantle the very structure it was meant to build.
Which leaves us with this final thought to mull over, something to take with you long after you finish your commute. If empathy is the glue that holds a civilized society together, but that exact same empathy can be exploited as a fatal weakness by those who do not share it, how do we build a society that protects the vulnerable without ultimately making itself the victim?
How do you cure the autoimmune disease when the disease feels exactly like compassion?